Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny Collier, and welcome to the Back to School Funding Juvenile Justice Reentry Supports with Title I Part D Education Dollars. Thanks for joining today. We have an exciting webinar, the first in hopefully a series of webinars that will be discussing how to use various types of federal funding to help support young people returning home from the juvenile justice system in their reentry and readmittance to school or an appropriate educational agency. The webinar today is being sponsored by the RFK Juvenile Justice Collaborative and the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, led by the RFK Children's Action Corps in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we have some terrific presenters. Again, my name is Jenny Collier, and I'm the project director for the RFK Juvenile Justice Collaborative, and we focus on youth reentry policy, in particular federal policy, and work in Washington, D.C. with members of Congress, many partners, and others to try to advance reentry policy and help young people return safely to their communities. I'll be moderating today's call, and our really fine speakers who are with us today include John McLaughlin, who is from the U.S. Department of Education, the Homeless, Neglected, or Delinquent Education Programs section, and Kathleen O'Neill Sandy, who is in Washington State as the Institution Education Program Supervisor of the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. Both Kathleen and John are fantastic partners who have worked each for many years on reentry and educational issues, John, we work with now as a partner on the AG's Reentry Council Juvenile Justice Subcommittee, and Kathleen's program in Washington State has really been one of the best programs operating and using the blending of different funding streams to advance reentry and support services for young people returning home. Just to briefly read their bios so you know who they are, John McLaughlin has been the federal coordinator of the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Program, and the federal program manager of the Title I Part D Neglected, Delinquent, or At-Risk Youth Program since March of 2008. And prior to that, he was the state coordinator for homeless, neglected, and delinquent education programs with the Minnesota Department of Education. John is a longtime educator in the fields of English and as a second language, migrant education, teacher education, and service learning. And so thanks again, John, for joining us today. We really appreciate all of your experience and knowledge and look forward to learning from you. Kathleen O'Neill Sandy has been an advocate for students for the past 22 years in Washington State, and as I mentioned, is currently serving as the Washington State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, where she has been the statewide program supervisor for juvenile offender education programs and the Title I Neglected, Delinquent, Supplemental programs for the past 10 years. And previous to this, Kathleen spent 7 years as the program coordinator of workforce training programs, advocating for dislocated timber workers who were searching for new careers, and then 5 years at the Washington Department of Corrections as the statewide program manager for adult and youthful offender basic skills programs. As you can see, both of them have a wealth of education and knowledge to impart upon us, and I really look forward to hearing their remarks today and seeing their PowerPoint presentations, which are really chock full of lots of resources for everyone, and we will be sending out that PowerPoint. Just briefly, before we get started with John's presentation, I also want to thank the folks who helped to put together today's webinar. It's been a collaborative and team effort, again, between the RFK Juvenile Justice Collaborative and the RFK National Resource Center, and several individuals have been involved, including McMoore from Washington State and Lee Mahoney from Massachusetts, who are consultants to the National Resource Center, and then Sorrell, who works for the Resource Center, and Adam, the Law and Policy Center for the Collaborative, who are here in D.C. with me this summer. And we are just, I want to just extend great thanks to everyone who participated in developing today's materials. So at this point, we're going to start with John McLaughlin, and today's webinar will focus on really looking at Title I Part D education funding and how it can support youth reentry. John will give us the global overview of the program and its uses in this area, and then Kathleen will give us a case study example from Washington State and her experience in using these funds to actually support youth reentry and access back into the educational system. So thanks again, John and Kathleen. And John, why don't you kick it off now with your presentation?
We can work to improve outcomes for the youth we serve. And so I'm going to go to this is the overview of the presentation. I've just mentioned that my orientation towards navigating you through the program. So I think we can go to the subpart 1 slide, the next slide. And the Title I Part D has been around since the beginning of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was enacted in 1965, so almost 50 years ago. And at that time, it was only a state agency program. I believe that that was probably more the norm for placements, for residential placements for youth offenders. And we're seeing, while that's the long-standing program, actually a significant reduction in the numbers served. I'll be presenting a little bit of data later, but it's just under 100,000 youth are served in this program, and I think we have about 700 programs. Definitely, every state has at least one state agency that is a grantee, usually a Department of Juvenile Justice or Corrections, sometimes Youth Services. It's similar to our also Title I Part A is the large ESEA program that you all know about, maybe through No Child Left Behind or ESEA Flexibility. Very similar in terms of rather tight fiscal requirements, some tighter eligibility requirements. So I'll help you understand which kinds of facilities and students are eligible for services. But very important in the next bullet is that every state Department of Education has a state coordinator who can help you, find out or know who are the agencies that are grantees in your state, what facilities they're serving. Some SEAs actually list that on their website or even post the approved applications for grants on their website, but certainly you can get more information through your state coordinator, and if you click on that link and click on the state, you'll have the name, email, phone number for that person. And also significant for the state agency program is there are clear provisions for transition services. There's a minimum of 15% of the grant to the state agency, a maximum of 30% that must go towards educationally related transition services with specific mention of subcontracting. And so I'll go into some details about that later. And let me just see here. So sometimes there's a gray area about whether a facility is under state agency oversight or whether it's a local agency program, and so we look at who is primarily responsible for the education, the public education of the youth in the facility, and that's one way to decide. And of course the state coordinator, the state educational agency, will coordinate with the juvenile justice agency or other agencies to determine, how best to categorize a facility. We know sometimes there are also multi-purpose facilities that cover, children and youth and child welfare as well as juvenile justice, and so, it's important to, find out from your state coordinator, state agency, were they looking at licensing, chartering, who the majority of youth were in determining what kind of facility it is. And then updated budget information is on our budget tables, just uploaded last week actually, because we make funds available every July 1st to state educational agencies, and ideally they're getting grants out to agencies by around the start of the school year, hopefully no later than September, unless they're on a different fiscal cycle. And we don't have the specific allocations to state agencies, just to the State Department of Education. And we are at $47.16 million. That was the same as the 2013 appropriation. Was a little higher in the previous year. So the program has been relatively level funding or slight cuts over the recent years. Okay, then if we go to the next slide about who's eligible to participate, this comes from our child count guidance, and that's an important basis for allocating funds to states. First of all, the eligible applicant is a state agency. It could be one, it could be an adult corrections agency that serves youth who are eligible for our services, and there may be some community day programs that are non-residential that are also served. And so in terms of some of the, and also, we have requirements like an agency must maintain fiscal effort in their program, 90% of the previous year's state and local funding. So there are other requirements to meet. And in terms of the facilities being eligible, they need to have an average length of stay for the youth they are educating of at least 30 days, or actually the youth in residence in the facility. And so that doesn't mean each individual must stay for at least 30 days, but for the whole facility, that average length of stay is important. So the funds are being targeted towards the facilities that have longer-term students. And then in terms of student eligibility, so for counting, we're counting the youth who are 20 years or younger, and they are enrolled in a regular program of instruction that's at least 15 hours a week in an adult facility or 20 hours per week in a juvenile facility or community day program. And so that minimum number of hours of a regular program of instruction are important because our funds are supplemental to state and local funding and shouldn't be supplanting the basic education requirements. We can serve students up till the day they turn 21. Often, many of them have educational disabilities, and so that's a right under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And then I will, going on to the next slide, I know we have so much to cover in our hour. I want to briefly introduce you to the local agency program, which is newer relatively. It was enacted in 1994 under Improving America Schools Act. Most states have a local agency program. It actually serves many more grantees and facilities, and so in general, we say there's roughly about 15,000 school districts around the country getting these grants, and they serve they have 3,000 different programs. Very often juvenile detention programs are served this way. And there are some states that don't have a local agency program because everything is under state agency oversight, including juvenile detention. And it was, this program has a lot of flexibility, particularly in who is served under the definition of at risk, as well as the allowable uses of funds. It's kind of ESEA flexibility before this current version, and it's very different from Subpart 1. So often the technical assistance we provide, it can be confusing because if it's a state agency program, there's tight fiscal and eligibility requirements. In the local agency program, it's broader. And this one would, I think both of them have opportunities to be contracting with and collaborating with various private nonprofit organizations. And on this slide, I also included mention of neglect. There are quite a lot of states that allow neglect facilities or programs, often kind of group foster homes under child welfare oversight, to operate a Subpart 2 program. They are also served through the larger Title I Part A funding with a kind of like a mandatory reservation, but Part D has broader uses of services, uses of funds, including transition services, and so I think that's an appealing reason for these kind of multi-purpose and child welfare facilities also to participate. The amount of money is much larger too. It's a reservation from the so Title I Part A is about $14 billion a year, so about 1% of that. For this year, it's $130 million is reserved, and each state is told how much they can use for making grants to school districts for the local agency program. And but to find it, you have to go into specific files for each state for their Part A allocations. And at the moment, only the 2013 allocations are online. They haven't posted the 2014 yet, since there's about 17,000 school districts in the country. So it's more to put together. And you can't find it, as a separate, catalog of federal domestic assistance number as a separate grant, but it is administered as a separate grant to school districts that may serve one or more facilities or run their own at-risk programs. So let me go into the eligibility for being counted for kind of the formula basis for allocating funds to states. And so, here we have a mention. Yes?
John, I'm sorry, this is Jenny. Before you start, I just want to flag for you that we have about 5 minutes or so more, so I just wanted to let you know in case you wanted to prioritize anything in particular.
Okay, sure, thanks. Yep, I will speed it up. I wasn't even noticing that. So, okay, so on this one, let me just say that, first of all, it's the geographical or census LEAs that submit a count to facilities that count as students and residents who are between the ages of 5 and 17 and have been there for at least one day within a 30-day window, one day of which must be in October. If they were enrolled twice separately during that 30-day period, they could be counted twice. And sometimes the geographical or census LEA does not want to serve these students directly, and so the state educational agency can find another LEA or directly provide services or contract to provide services themselves. And in a few cases, I'm seeing an increasing trend towards the education programs at some juvenile detention centers or halls, and particularly large counties and cities, being operated as charter schools, and the school district, the State Department of Ed may receive account and directly provide grants to the charter school in that situation. There's no minimum or maximum for transition services in Subpart 2, but there is a special rule that if 70% of the youth in a facility return to the LEA that got the grant, then they must provide transition services. There's also a piece in Subpart 2 that you can't do at-risk and delinquency prevention programming at the expense of not serving those youth who are in facilities within the school district boundaries or returning to that district. Okay, so let's go on then to, I'll just say briefly on the purposes of the Part D program on the next slide. I'm not going to read these, but just to mention that these three main purposes are crucial when we're looking at allowable uses of funds. You know, we look at this statutory language and do the services or activities proposed fulfill these three main purposes, and that's how we would know. First of all, to be allocable, it must serve neglected, delinquent, or at-risk youth, you know, the programs that they're enrolled in. To be allowable, there are broad uses of funds that I'll mention in a minute, and then, you know, that they're necessary and reasonable on a per pupil basis, not exorbitant per pupil for the different kinds of educational services provided, and definitely should be based on needs assessment data, you know, the educational needs of the youth, past costs for activities, the effectiveness of those activities for outcomes for previously served youth. Moving right along briskly to the transition services requirement for the state agency program. Here again is that minimum 15%, maximum 30%. So of a $47 million appropriation, that's $7 to $14 million nationally. And I've highlighted in the second bullet the statutory provision for contracting with one or more school districts, other public agencies, or private nonprofit organizations to provide these transition services. And also that every state agency facility must designate an individual as a transition coordinator, and we take that to mean educationally related transition as well. So I'll go on now to the types of transition services on the next slide that are mentioned in the statute that you know, are the different kinds of education transition. And I'm not going to read them because there's an awful lot here, but you can see there's an emphasis on helping youth, you know, complete their secondary education and access and roll in post-secondary or vocational and technical training we call career and technical education. Sometimes the early college dual enrollment types of programs where you can get both high school course credit and college credit are a way that you know, some agencies may do this. And of course, a lot of vocational training and employment, including internships and whatnot. So all of these, you know, anything mentioned in the statute, of course, is allowable, as well as any other activity or service that would, you know, be within the purview of the program. Okay, moving on to, I guess, yeah, we had it over two slides. So in terms of application requirements, I just want to mention that there are a lot of requirements to coordinate with other federal education programs, including this larger Title I Part A. Many corrections agencies have their education program as a school district now to access various kinds of federal education funds, career and technical education, dropout prevention, special education, of course, is a huge resource for this population. And they must ensure that student records are shared with sending and receiving school districts. They need to coordinate with businesses for mentoring and training if there are, you know, organizations in the community interested in working with our population. And they must involve parents in the children's education. And, you know, there's an assurance that they do that, but we like to hear what activities they're doing to involve. And sometimes that involves technology and, you know, video teleconferencing and telephone, as well as directly bringing parents out and providing information about their children's education, how they're performing, as well as the programming they're receiving. Okay, then going on to the next one. So I just want to, for the Subpart 2 local agency program mentioned that state departments of education can target the grants to the districts whose facilities have the highest counts, so that where the numbers and percentages are greater. And so some will not allow districts that have a small facility with a bed count of 10 or fewer, or maybe 9 or fewer, to apply for grant funding. So you need to find out from your state coordinator if they have specific policies. Also, if children are placed through private insurance or something, they may not allow those facilities to be eligible. Then I mentioned the special rule, then that second bullet, so for providing transition services. The State Department of Education should be notifying school districts that they have eligible facilities in their boundaries. They should coordinate with corrections and juvenile justice to, identify these facilities. And then, of course, that the NOD youth who've been in facilities and are reentering, their needs need to be prioritized before doing any at-risk, delinquency prevention programming. Okay, and then I'm probably already past the time, so let me just look and see here. Can we show the uses of funds and service eligibility? And I'm not going to read it. You can just see the 5 broad uses of funds and the long list of who's eligible as at risk to be served by the local agency program. And then if we could go to the next slide, just want to mention that every facility, a juvenile correctional facility, must have a written formal agreement with the school district that's receiving the funds on their behalf. And it puts accountability on both sides, the district and the facility. And that, they must disaggregate performance data. The state departments of ed, of course, report that to us. We do see it at the school district and program level, and are increasingly using that in our monitoring and conversations with states. And states could reduce or terminate funding if there's poor performance or the statute mentions high dropout rates. And then this next slide I'm just going to show you on the data. I'm not going to read it, but you can see some of the demographics of who served by race, ethnicity, age, just the numbers did. And there's a lot more information on even state-specific information at the link at the bottom. And then on the next slide, I'm actually also, this is on Title I Part A services. So I've been alluding to this larger program with the mandatory reservation for neglect or child welfare kind of group home children, but also an optional one for youth who are returning from juvenile corrections or community day programs. And even if they're reentering into a district and the high school is not a Title I school, there's an optional reservation for comparable services for them. And so that's another point of coordination with the school district. And I just have one more slide, I believe. And I just want to give you an orientation to the counting and funding cycle so you know when to have these conversations. And the cycle begins on the top right with number 1. So this fall, we'll give the guidance out to states on how to count youth in both state and local agency facilities, residential facilities. And those counts would come in to the State Department of Ed in December, come to us in January. We double check them. If a state has had a change of 10%, increase or decrease, we just want to make sure they think their numbers are correct, because that is a basis of making the formula grants available in July. And while we do announce preliminary amounts in the spring, we're using the previous year's data. So we had 2013 data used until last week when we showed the amounts using the 2014 data. And so I'd really recommend right now is the time to be reaching out to your state coordinator in the Department of Ed or state agency or a school district that has a facility to have conversations to ensure that those youth are being counted so that they can go into the formula by which funds are made available. And then, if grants are made next July and you want to contract with services or collaborate in some way, they'll be planning those programs next spring. And you definitely want to make those contacts and have those relationships in place before then. With that, I will stop. I know we're right at 2:30. I apologize for going over, but we'll handle Q&A, I'm sure, in general after Kathleen presents.
That sounds great. Thank you, John. Just really 2 super quick questions that came in. First, where is the information about the 70% requirement you discussed?
So that was a bullet on the slide, although I paraphrased it. It's a special rule in the statute, and it's very rare in our monitoring. We've had very few districts where 70% of the youth in a facility re-enter schools in that district. Usually the facility serves kids from a variety of districts or all around the state or even around the country.
Thanks. And then the last quick question before we move to Kathleen. I'm going to read it from the chat box. Will it reduce or eliminate? Will the reduce or eliminate funding piece of Section 1426 only apply to Subpart 2?
That's in fact, I believe it's under Subpart 2, Section 1426, if I'm not mistaken.
So it would only apply to Subpart 2.
Yes,
okay,
that's
great.
correct.
Thank you. Okay, those were the two quick questions we got that I thought we should ask now, but then I'm going to hand it over to Kathleen Sandy. So thanks, Kathleen. Take it away. And thanks, John. What a great presentation.
Sure, you're welcome.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Jenny, for inviting me. I'm excited to talk about our programs in Washington State. Today I'll be talking about the youth population in our state, the size of our juvenile justice system, where they're located just quickly, and then go into the federal Title I-D funding and how we use it to help youth get back to school or to stay in school after incarceration. Slide. So in Washington, we have about 706,000 kids who are between the ages of 10 and 17. And you can see the ethnic breakdown, just to kind of give you the size compared to your state. On the right, you see the entries into the detention centers and the long-term facilities. So we keep counts on how many duplicates there are, as well as unduplicate counts, meaning Johnny comes in once, and then later in the year he comes in again, and he comes in again. So we want to keep those counts. I think it's important to use for our legislative information to say we've got 17,500 entries into our detention center rather than the 9,800, because we've had to take care of those kids 17,000 times, not the 9,000 times. So I think that those numbers show much more of our system better than just the unduplicate counts. We have 22 detention centers, which are the short-term average stay of 7 to 10 days, and we have 4 long-term facilities, which are average stay of 6 months or more. Next slide. Slide. So here you just see a picture. This just depicts that in Washington, our facilities are all over the state. The red ones are large long-term. All the other blue ones are the detention centers or the group homes. So this just kind of, rather than some states have them all in the metropolitan area or maybe all in the eastern or southern part of their state. Slide. So in Washington, my agency, Superintendent of Public Instruction, manages both the Subpart 1 and Subpart 2 that John talked about. Subpart 1, we use the funding for academic improvement because the kids are there longer. Subpart 2, we use it for transition and dropout intervention. But we use it both inside and outside our detention centers so that we do some prevention work as well as some intervention. So back in 2006, after I was here a few years, we talked to the Department of Ed and found out that we were, so we received the $885,000 for our count in October, but we found out that the method we were using for counting was incorrect. And so we were smart and fixed our counting and tripled our dollars. So some of the states I know after us had done that same thing and generated a lot more money for our kids. So from here on in, I'm going to be talking about how I use the Subpart 2 funding for transition services. Slide. So in 2008, I went to Georgetown and completed the Multisystem Integration Certificate Program, and I think some people on the call may be familiar with the Georgetown Center for Juvenile Justice Reform. If not, it's a great program, and it has some really outstanding staff there. So that project, or that program for a week, had us each do a capstone project. And so because I had the additional funding and because I had the learning from the Georgetown project, I chose to look at using education advocates in detentions and in middle and high schools, so that we would have that continuum of services when youth were leaving juvenile justice and then they were going back to the schools, as well as doing some intervention for prevention services, for the middle school kids who really needed it, who were kind of on the cusp. I think that using the funding this way helped us, because previously we were only using it in the detentions, and it made the, you'd have the kids inside, and then you'd say, oh great, we did some good work to connect you with your school, goodbye and good luck. But then the kids would continue to come back because they'd go back to school. They would have problems there maybe that they didn't have an advocate to help them get through. And so this is what we were trying to do, was to help that project, help those kids as they left to walk into their school, have an advocate with them, and then be able to solve their problems before they would be coming back to juvenile justice, hopefully. Next slide. So I looked on the N&D website. This is our technical assistance that John talked about with the Department of Education. So it's Neglected Delinquent Technical Assistance Center. And these people are great. They have, they provide us with all kinds of training and information and questions, responses. So you can look up their website. I think John gave you the link to it. It's neglected-delinquent.org. So I looked at their effective transition system information and said, whoa, this is the kind of stuff we need. We need coordinated service offerings. We need to use a transition coordinator, a specialist, and we call them an advocate, who's creating transition plans with the youth, who's giving the youth and their family some high levels of assistance, using culturally sensitive practices, but also important are the fact of high agency involvement, court involvement, school involvement, all of these entities working together. Then you have, of course, the need for sufficient funding, and then you also need to track and monitor your system, track your data, track your outcomes, who's coming into the system. The other thing I wanted to mention is that on the N&D website in the technical assistance area, that they do have the list of state coordinators like myself. There's one in every state, and we're actually having our conference in DC next week. So you can contact your coordinator that does what I do in Washington State. Next slide. So I looked at, how did I determine how we were using the funds and would it work? We, found out that we had the large funding increase, and I looked at the fact that we were losing much of our safe and drug-free funds at that time from the Department of Ed. So I looked at our data and found out that we had a gap in re-engaging our youth into school after they were out of detention. So when they were going back and forth, we didn't have enough percentage getting back to school. So I figured that we needed this continuum of services for those youths so that less of them would come back. And we needed the coordination of services between detention, the high schools, and the middle schools. And I decided to use a statewide coordination or a statewide system of tracking and monitoring. And again, considering that we needed a high level of coordination both with the schools, the courts, the ESDs, or the providers that I'll talk about in a minute, and the facility staff themselves. Slide. So my vision was to increase the services to kids, to address the needs of both incarcerated kids and the kids who are at risk of incarceration or at risk of dropping out, to help the youth overcome barriers to getting to school, but also in that system, barriers of how many kids, you know, you're going into a system, a school system, and you can't find your way through that system. So that's part of the coordination that the advocates do. And the result is that we would have then a system with advocate positions across the state, serving detention and some state facilities, but also serving the middle and high school youth who might otherwise drop out. So I began a relationship with the 9 regional educational service districts, which are similar to regional support systems in other states, and they were already serving kids prevention intervention like drug and alcohol treatment in the high schools. Since they already had those relationships in the high schools, this was a very good fit, and they were already using common goals, a statewide scope, and they were already working with kids who are in juvenile justice and in child welfare. So those 3 things were important to me. Next slide. So who makes decisions on these kinds of things? So myself, the program supervisor, I had worked with, after I had written out what my vision was and what my plan was, I outlined a plan with my director and assistant superintendent at SPI, as well as our prevention intervention director. Since her funding was diminishing, then we looked at using the ESDs that she was working with in prevention, and they use a public health 3-tier public health case management model, and I'll talk about that in a second. So then I spoke with the Neglected Delinquent Technical Assistance Center, got information, also spoke with the federal program specialist like John, and I'm not sure that it was John at the time. It may have been when they were crossing over, just before John came on. And they agreed that since we had already allocated state funding to many of our ESDs in our state, that they could be considered LEAs, and that's an important point. They already allocated the federal home list to the ESDs, and so we were able to allocate directly to them. My superintendent got hold of the regional ESD superintendents and informed them of what our idea was, and then I directly worked with the prevention intervention directors, so we had 9 of them in a group that agreed to move forward with this. I put on a statewide video conference with the directors who would lead the work, and they needed, of course, lots of information and clarification, and they weren't sure quite what they were getting into, but they agreed to the plan. Finally, I decided that we would have one ESD prevention director act as the lead, so that the other directors and myself could work together with that person, so that we would all be on the same page, and we would have 2 of us giving them technical assistance. As well, we decided to produce an education advocate manual to maintain the fidelity of the program and to share with others or other states who wanted to replicate the project. And I do have that link later on in the slideshow. Next slide. So I'll just go over this slightly. We just, when I collaborated between the ESDs and the districts, the ESDs then had to conduct a needs assessment and do their planning. They had to select a target group. Who were they going to serve? What schools might they have their advocates in? And what groups, what ethnic groups maybe that they wanted to target, and how to coordinate with the facility. So a lot of coordination between the area ESD director and then how they would coordinate with the detention center or with the kids in the schools. So they began by using this public health model. Next slide. So high needs, so the kids with the highest needs would get daily monitoring and support. The kids with the moderate need would have weekly or biweekly monitoring and support, and the kids with the lower need would have monthly or quarterly contact. Slide. So what actually do the advocates do? You see they do kind of everything. Everything from assessing with a strength-based instrument, developing a student-driven success plan, to locating employment, helping them improve their attendance, calling them up in the morning and saying, Johnny, here I am, I'm waiting for you to come to school, or did you get your homework done? So it's very personalized service. They assess the needs, they help develop a plan, then they check back on the youth and help them to monitor their behavior and change it if necessary. But they're their friends. They know that they're going to be there for them. And here are the youth that generally do not have an adult in their life on a consistent basis. Slide. So the ESDs had to gather information. They had to find out from the kids, where did you go to school, what's your criminal history, what are your living arrangements, and then decide how and what services might be applicable for that youth. The middle school is a little different group. We're always looking more at low grades, failing grades, falling behind, lack of educational engagement, and health risk. Health risk is a really important prevention key. Slide. So they do this strength-based assessment, they do screening, they refer to mental health and drug and alcohol, and ask a variety of questions. Slide. I'll try to get through these a little faster. This is basically what our grant has, the responses that they have to have in their grants. I provide TA, I provide monitoring of the grants, and all of our grants are approved, and we have all of our grants online. Slide. Next slide. I got it here. Oh, you do.
Kathleen, do you see the slide? Did you want the one before that, the youth served?
Youth served, yes, thank you.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. So this is just our numbers and our dollars. So you can see over the years that the numbers we've served have gone up, and then they've gone back down due to the dollars starting at 1.2 million and going up and then going down. In the middle years, those were when we had the Recovery Act additional dollars, so we were able to serve more kids. But remember that these advocates, and we probably have some 40-ish advocates throughout the state, they have small to medium caseloads of relatively 25 to 35 kids on the caseload. So not very big caseloads, it's very individualized attention. Last slide, I think. Last slide is on outcomes. So this gives you an idea of how many kids we're getting in school. This is an average over the years. The youth coming out of detention, and then the at-risk youth in the middle and high schools. Lots of credits, enrolled in job training, percentages, getting to employment and job training. But those are the outcomes that we track, along with all the other federal outcomes that John requires, and we keep track of that on a state database. So I'm going to open it up to questions.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. That was a really helpful presentation. If you see, there is a resource slide right after Kathleen's outcome slide. So I just want to highlight that for folks. She has a manual, some interviews and academic achievement review and research, and then information sharing. So I encourage you to look at both John and Kathleen's resource slides to get more information. And this is Jenny again moderating. I want to let folks know we have some questions that have come in via the chat. So I want to start off with those really quickly, and we're going to go as long as we can. And so let's get that started. Kathleen, I think this is for you. Because there's now a fee associated with young people taking the GED test, are SEAs allowed to redistribute funding based on the needs of the students of the facilities versus the student count? Actually, that may be for John. I'm not sure.
So I'm just wondering whether to respond to the question about GED fees or, how funding gets distributed, to agencies based on needs. But this question comes up, at least every year, at least once, and we don't prohibit grantees or sub-grantees from using Title I Part D funds to pay for GED test fees or preparation. We know it's going to become more expensive with the online GED. We certainly want the program to be oriented towards, high school course credit bearing courses and earning a high school diploma, but also understand that providing the option of a GED in preparation for it is important. Some state departments of education or state agencies don't allow the Part D dollars to be used for that. And back in the 1990s, before this last authorization, we also did not allow Subpart 1 to pay for GED fees.
Okay. Did you want to do you want to add anything else, John, before we move on? I just want to make sure you didn't want to address the count issue further.
Could you repeat the part about the count versus
Sure.
need? Yeah.
The question was, are SEAs allowed to redistribute funding based on needs of the students of the facilities versus the student count, per se?
Well, so in the Subpart 1 program, I think the formula is particularly important, and we allow a State Department of Ed to use more recent administrative data than maybe even the child count they gave us, so that they could have more current data. But I don't know if it could necessarily be based on need alone, but I know that there are state agencies that choose not to serve small facilities or certain kinds. And then on the Subpart 2 part, I've already mentioned they can target it to where the numbers and percentages of students are greater. I wonder if Kathleen has, if you use any of that discretion at all in Washington State.
Yeah, in Washington, we do put the money out to the facilities by the count, but when we do the grants to the ESDs for education advocates or other of that type work, we do it by I really select I look at the need, and then I select a targeted amount of money per advocate. So I give them out, I put money in that pot for advocates versus the detention, and then I divide it out by how many advocates are in each region. So it isn't necessarily by need, but it's more equally dividing it by so that across the state, the most kids are going to be assisted.
And I think I'm understanding there that, your Part D dollars are also going to, juvenile correctional education, detention education, and then the piece that you're using for transition, you're using different kinds of need data to fund individuals. Is that right?
Correct. We give it to the detentions. We take our subpart 2 money and divide it out so that one chunk goes to the detentions by the count, and then the other part goes to advocates by this regional division.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Both those answers were excellent. There was a question about, Kathleen, whether colleges or universities are participating, and if yes, how are they doing that?
They're participating with our facilities, like our long-term facilities are using their local college will come in and do classes and those kinds of things, as far as and testing. So we do participate that way. As far as the colleges being a participant of this education advocate work, they have not jumped on that bandwagon yet.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question is, to what degree has OSPI and the State Juvenile Justice Agency in Washington coordinated with Models for Change implementations at the local level in jurisdictions such as Spokane or Clark counties that have had significant Models for Change program investment and support from the MacArthur Foundation?
I think in Washington, we integrate really well with Models for Change in both those counties, as well as in the other, I think there's at least 8 other pieces in Washington of the Models for Change. I just saw a presentation by the folks in Clark County about the education advocate work and how they were integrating it. So it's really integrated within the county, like within Clark County or within Spokane County. The advocates go into court, go to the Models for Change meetings, integrate with those folks that are doing Models for Change. And so I think in Washington, we feel pretty integrated with all of that work.
Thanks, Kathleen. That's really helpful to know. I think that's been a very special opportunity that you've leveraged, having Models for Change be so active in your state. So I'm glad to hear that that leveraging and integration has gone so well.
Absolutely.
The same person asked a question related to Oakland, California. That city obtained a Second Chance Act grant, which is a federal DOJ grant that supports reentry programming, and they ended up playing an intermediary role to ensure the presence of educational handoffs, so to speak, from the county JJ system to the Oakland Public Schools. But it sounds, in your case, with OSPI in Washington, that you've created incentives and perhaps, facilitated or pushed the creation of similarly strong handoffs and relationships between the juvenile justice system and the educational components of your states. Do you want to expound on that just a little bit, please?
Yeah, it was a very interesting process because once the ESDs said, yes, we would like to do this, and of course they had lost funding, so we were replacing some of their lost funding, and they were able to keep some of their staff on board. They, came back to me a couple months later and said, now what was it we were doing? Now, who did we have to go talk to? You mean we have to go in detentions? So walking through that whole process of integrating them with their local detention folks, and even sometimes going there personally and introducing the two, was really key in this whole integration. I think that the juvenile justice folks have really learned about education advocates in their local area. So it's not a top-down model. It's a model where the local Clark County folks at the ESD have gone out to the detention center, learned what their processes are and who they're working with, and then made relationships. And that's what our business is about. It's about creating relationships so that the kids can do better. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that's helpful. Thank you. There are a lot of questions here. If our speakers have another couple of minutes, I might push us a little bit past 3 if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's fine with me, Jenny. And actually, can I add, I had a thought to reflect on the need versus count, and for the LEA-based at-risk programming, that would be based on a needs assessment. So serving at-risk kids, you'd be using data based on need rather than the formula counts of neglected or delinquent children and youth. And then I also think I didn't emphasize clearly enough that the parents of Title I Part D served students are really important here. They have the right to not only know how their children are performing, but just information on the program and be part of the planning and evaluation of the program that's operated by a school district or even a state agency. And so, if you're working with youth or their parents or legal guardians, make sure they know they have the right to that information.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And actually, I've gotten a couple of questions from folks, Kathleen, about how you corrected your count to increase funding.
Okay,
people are paying attention, so.
No, that's great. So what we were doing was what we understood the October count to be is counting. They said it was a 30-day October count, and so what people previous to me understood was that we were counting kids who were there for 30 days in the month of October. In other words, Johnny was there for all 30 days. So we were counting all those Johnnies, and that got us to the 550 number. What the count is supposed to be is it's supposed to be the count of all kids within the 30 days of October. So we counted Johnny, and Mary and Susie, all of the kids who had been there during those 30 days, rather than just only the children who had been there for 30 consecutive days.
Okay. That's great. That's really helpful to understand. There's another question here that I think both of you might be able to address. I'm going to combine sort of two questions. One is a general question about how nonprofit organizations that have intervention or prevention programs best fit in and support the reentry of young people and students. And then is there any sort of discussion regarding supportive services that come with funding for mental health or substance use disorder services for youth? So if so, could there be contracting with community-based organizations to provide those services? I know that those issue areas in particular, and I think you mentioned health yourself, Kathy, during your presentation, are of great concern to a lot of folks out in the field.
Right. I'll answer first, and I'll let John. So we try to refer to mental health and other services, drug and alcohol. Of course, most of our folks who are with the ESDs are already providing that prevention, intervention, drug and alcohol services. So half their job might be that. The other half might be the education advocate work. So that's very fortunate, and it's a very good partnership. But when if there aren't any services in the area, then we have not gone too much into the mental health services. We've tried to work with our university, University of Washington, that's been providing some information on mental health, and also to work with our state facilities that do provide some mental health services. But the other thing I want to mention is that we do have another chunk of that money that we use in three ESD areas just on health services. So we're doing some health prevention for little kids in elementary and middle schools to prevent them from ever going into juvenile justice. And that program has really taken off and has gotten some really national attention.
That's great, Kathleen. If you want to give us information about that we can add to the PowerPoint or distribute, please feel free. Yeah. We'll be distributing the PowerPoint to everyone after this, and that sounds like it would be a great program to highlight.
Right, I can give you a link to that information as well. I just wanted to also mention that on the nonprofits, we do partner with nonprofits like Youth Source in Seattle, and they use the same student-driven plan. They use the same importance of having an adult in their life, those kinds of things. So we support all those connections that we can where they exist.
That's great. And here's, I think, one of our last questions we're going to take from the chat, and then I'm going to ask Lee and Mick if they have any final burning questions. But this is for John, I think. Can any of the Title I funds, neglected and delinquent funds, be used to support foster children that are in foster homes?
So, yeah, the definition of whatever residential institution for children or youth who are neglected excludes foster homes directly, and we know there's this gray area of foster homes with multiple children and group homes with very few children, and so that's where the state coordinator and the public child welfare agency counterpart need to coordinate and decide which facilities are eligible for the services. So foster care really is an area where the Title I Part D program doesn't target those children, although presumably they're in Title I schools getting Title I services.
Right.
Could I just add, though, on the health piece that the Subpart 2 use of funds and service eligibility slide did mention coordination of health and social services, and the statutory citation goes deeper into mental health and drug and alcohol counseling, and so you can find the statutory language for Section 1424 either on our program webpage or NDTEC's webpage that I put in the resource slide. And then I would just add, for developing these partnerships, just like we have the federal, Reentry Council, Juvenile Reentry Committee, it would be, and I know there are local ones, there may even be state ones that now, everybody's heard more about Title I Part D, to bring your state and local contacts for the program to the table and ask them more about their reentry programming and services. And I know reentry is one of those things that no one agency or program alone can do and do well, and it requires collaboration. And so I'd really like to see more of those conversations happening involving our program, around the country.
Right, and I'd like to add that I am all for us not only providing the advocates with the title money, and I think that the more that either schools or facilities or even communities can learn from the advocate work, that they can combine their funding to get training from current advocates. We'd be glad to do some training so that those folks, that work can double.
Great. I think you both make a good point that we need to be really investigating as many resources as possible to bring to the table for these particular young people. And this is Jenny Collier again from the RFK Juvenile Justice Collaborative, and I want to thank both John and Kathleen for doing such a fantastic job today. And I've learned a lot, and I know folks in the field have gotten a lot of questions answered. I think that before we wrap up today, I want to see if two people from our planning committee, Mick Moore out in Washington State with Kathleen, or Lee Mahoney from the RFK Children's Action Corps and National Resource Center in Massachusetts, wanted to ask any last burning questions or had any final comments.
I'll just this is Mick Moore, just make one comment quickly. I know we're out of time. I was at the Educational Service District during the early years when Kathleen was doing this work, and I just want to point out what a tremendous opportunity it was for education to partner with juvenile justice. And we were able, through her funding, to provide educational advocates from our educational system inside of the detention centers and work on the GED Plus concept, and then connect them to the community through apprenticeships and other opportunities. And it was a great bridge that we otherwise didn't have. And so I just want people to realize that this can be a tremendous relationship-building opportunity between those two systems with greater outcomes, reducing recidivism, and so forth with these youth. So it was a wonderful opportunity for us to join as a partner with the Title I Part D funding.
Thanks, Mick. Lee, do you have anything to add, or any last question?
My last question was one that Kathleen actually touched upon as she was wrapping up her comments, and it's directly in line with what Mick just said as well. I was wondering if the advocate work that was done on the per-student basis resulted in any changes or additional programming or developments at the LEA level or even the state level. As need was identified, could it be extrapolated or grown into programming for a more aggregate population? And it sounds like that's exactly what did happen, and I hate to belabor this call as people are hanging on, but it's fabulous work and a fabulous webinar, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Mick and Lee. And again, thanks to everybody for hanging on for some extra minutes. It looks like we have a lot to talk about when we get together and talk about funding. And again, I want to thank both Kathleen and John for their fantastic presentations. We will be circulating these slides to everyone who registered, and we will be putting up the portion of the webinar that was recorded, and we'll let you know where that is so you can pass it along to your friends and colleagues. And I also want to thank, again, the co-sponsors, the RFK National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice, led by the RFK Children's Action Corps in Massachusetts, and the RFK Juvenile Justice Collaborative, which does youth reentry work here in Washington, D.C. The last slide says thank you and has my contact information. I'm the project director here in D.C. of the Juvenile Justice Collaborative, and also the National Resource Center's web page. So please feel free to let us know if you have any questions, and we are grateful for everyone's participation today, especially our speakers and planning committee. Thank you so much, everyone, and we look forward to hopefully continuing this webinar series and tackling yet another federal funding stream. If you have any suggestions or funding streams you've been particularly interested in and that you would like to learn about, please let us know. Take care. Everyone have a great day.